nice to be here today. And I would say, actually, that you're all quite lucky to be here. You know, in less than 4 days, we had more registrations for this event than seats. And I think that's a good sign. It's a sign that actually a shift is happening in Thailand. It's a sign that you're actually tired of status quo. It's a sign that you want to have real change. And a good way to drive real change is actually to put pressure on companies, like dtac, to put pressure on us to do the right thing and be a good company, but also acknowledge companies that are executing with high standards. But what is then a good company? What does it actually mean? Ask yourself. Think a little bit. What is a good company? We've asked also the consumers in Thailand. We've been running focus groups. We've been running 12 focus groups, both in Bangkok and also outside of Bangkok. And here is what the consumers told us. A good company is a company that's good to me. Not really surprising. It's a company that have good products, good prices, good service, and of course, no cheating. Really important. And I fully acknowledge this. This is key, it's important. But this is not enough. To be a good company, you also need to drive your business. You need to operate your business in a responsible way. So we also asked the consumers, what do they think now about things like fair competition? What do they think about say no to corruption? What do they think about good governance? And here's what they told us. Never thought about it. Or we do not care much. So it's clear when we start talking about driving business in a good way, it's not fully understood or not perceived as equally important. So if you rank the answers, by far, good to me is most important. And when it comes to good governance and running the business in a good way, it's less important to the consumers today. But the consumers can get so much more by just asking for it. So if customers start asking for fair competition, if they're asking for no bribes, if they start asking for companies to drive their business with good governance, they will actually get better products, they will get better service, and also lower price. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about 3 myths in Thailand that holds the consumers back. So the first one, fair competition just happens. When we talk to the consumers in the focus groups, it's very clear that competition, not that important. There were even consumers saying that having one company, that's a monopoly, or 2 companies, that's the duopoly, is actually good for competition. Well, I would strongly disagree to that. I normally visit Chiang Mai at least twice a year. If I can, I visit even more because I like Chiang Mai. And especially in the wintertime where the climate's fantastic. But if you visit Chiang Mai, actually fair competition is a real proof point why it's super important with competition. So if I fly to Chiang Mai, if I did this in 2003, it was super expensive. It cost 4,500 baht for a round trip to Chiang Mai. If I fly to Chiang Mai today, how does it look like? You know, most of the prices since 2003 has really been going up quite a big time. But if I fly to Chiang Mai today, it only costs 2,000 baht for a round trip. Why is that? What happened? What happened was deregulation. So more players were allowed to fly domestically in Thailand. So you had players like AirAsia, you had players like Nok Air coming in, and you saw prices dropping. They dropped instantly, and even Thai Airways dropped their prices. So does fair competition matter? I would say yes. Another less obvious downside with not having fair competition in the market is also that the products and service suffer. Because if you only have 1 or 2 companies in the market, they don't really need to innovate. They don't really need to have good service. because the customers, they don't have anywhere else to go. They need to go to that one or two companies. So one example of this is if you want to go to Chiang Mai, but by train instead, where we don't have any competition. It takes a very long time. You need to take a sleeper train all night. And the price is often more expensive than flying. And the service, as you know, is definitely not as good. So with fair competition, you get both better products, better service, and lower price. And also with the market, if you have a monopoly in a market or even a duopoly in the market, of course you want to protect that to any price. You don't want to have new companies coming in, because that will destroy your nice way of operating. And one way, of course, to prevent other companies from coming in is to pay bribes to key stakeholders, to make it more difficult for other players to come in. And of course, paying bribes, that's wrong, it's illegal. But on top of that, where does the money to pay bribes come from? It comes from you guys. It comes from the customers. And of course, that's money that instead should go to either lower prices or better products or better services. So I hope I convinced you now that fair competition is key both for lower prices and better products. But another area that's important is what we call good governance. And what we really mean is that we run, as a company, we run our business in a responsible way. And when we talk to the focus groups here, it's very clear, governance. I have no idea. What are we talking about? What's governance? And many confuse it with this CSR thing, this corporate social responsibility. So they think good governance is if you go out and plant trees once a year as a company, or good governance is if you give donation to communities that are poor or had some kind of catastrophe. And there's nothing wrong with CSR. CSR is clearly important, of course. But I would say it's a drop in the ocean compared to the energy and time that we spend on running our core business. So if we want to change as companies, we need to change the way we drive our core business. That's the only way how we can change and become better companies. But that's, of course, more difficult. It takes more effort. And one example here is telecom towers. You know, it's around 60,000 telecom towers in Thailand. It's many, many thousands of people that's been working on constructing those towers, both building them but also maintaining them over time. And it's been many, many hundreds of severe accidents when it comes to telecom towers. And this is because that the workers don't have the right education for climbing the towers, or they don't have the right safety equipment, so they don't use the safety harness. And of course, what happens? Some of them fall down, and the consequence is, of course, dramatic. But many of those workers, they're not employed directly by the operators. They work for subcontractors. And of course, you can say, not my responsibility. It's the subcontractor's responsibility to fix this. But it's not. It's also our responsibility. We need to secure that the contractors take action. At dtac, we have a zero accident policy. So we spend a lot of effort on this. We go out in the field. We do a lot of audits. We do a lot of inspections with our subcontractors, and we also do a lot of education. And so far, that's really been paying off with no fatal accidents with the workers employed by dtac. So what do you think? Is it more important that we put dtac employees once a year on a bus going to plant some trees in a mangrove forest? Or is it more important that we actually focus on the safety of all the thousands of people working on our towers every day? If you ask Kung Kit and his family, he is one of our engineers that are working on the towers every day. If you ask him and his family, it's very clear. Of course, it's the safety that's more important. Of course. So you, as consumers in Thailand, you don't only deserve good products, but you also deserve companies that really respect and focus on human safety and human lives. That's key. So this audits and inspections, there's a lot of things we do around that. It's hard work, but I wouldn't say it's the most difficult thing we do. The most difficult thing we do is actually change the old way of doing business. And probably one of the most difficult rules for us to enforce is zero tolerance to corruption. By zero tolerance, I really mean zero tolerance. It's far beyond paying bribes. Our head of legal, he calls this rule the no golfing rule. So it means, for example, dtac, we cannot invite important people to the golf course to play golf and pay for a hugely expensive green fee. We cannot. We cannot sponsor a so-called research trip to an exotic country. We cannot. We cannot give gifts unless they are very, very minor value with a dtac logo on it. We cannot. And when we introduced those rules, the no golfing rule in dtac, of course, employees were screaming, "What are you doing? This is going to be so tough. We cannot compete with the other guys in the market. Why are we doing this?" And the reason for us doing this is very important. And that is that we believe, again, in fair competition. And we believe in that the government should be independent, the regulator should be independent, and the press should be independent. And we, as dtac, we don't want to influence key stakeholders to our benefit. So we want to have a society with independency and fair competition. But in one aspect, actually, these pretty strict rules have made lives easier for our employees, because it's pretty clear what you can do and what you cannot do. So for example, if you're an engineer, a field engineer, a young field engineer out in the field and want to get access or acquire a site for erecting a new tower, and he's asked out there to pay facilitation money to get access to that site, it's very easy for him. He knows immediately, I cannot pay facilitation money. But let me be frank here. Us operating with high standards also require that consumers and you guys as customers think that high standards are important. That you really think that companies operating in a good way is important. Because if not, it might actually be a competitive disadvantage. Then our employees might be right. So we need consumers, we need customers to put pressure on companies to do the right thing. And that leads me to the last myth, the third myth, that change can only come from the top. When I talk to people, many say that, yeah, of course, I'm against bribes. They should not be paid. But then they also said, come on, what can I do? I can't influence the companies or the government anyway, so I don't do anything. I just shut my eyes. But actually, as a consumer, you have an immense power if you just tap into it. And one really good example of this is what happened to Nike, where the consumers actually drove Nike to really change the way they do business. And this is a story from in the beginning of the 90s, where was a report showing that Nike used child labor. Nike had very poor working conditions and even abuse in their sweatshop where they produced their shoes. And of course, when this report was published, it was a media frenzy. All the media was on Nike. And to a large extent, in the beginning, they dodged this bullet by saying, look at our fantastic code of conduct. Look at our great policies. But that was just words on the paper. They have not implemented any of that. And consumers saw that. And they became more and more angry. And what happened, of course, they stopped buying Nike shoes. And after a while, the Nike CEO had to come out himself and say, hey, Nike is now synonymous to child labor, synonymous to abuse and poor working conditions. And people don't want to buy products from such a company. So in that aspect, I would say consumers had won. And since then, Nike has really cleaned up. They're now open about all the sweatshops and factories that you have, so you can go there yourself and inspect. But they, of course, also do a lot of inspections and audits themselves. But that was just the beginning. I think we have a lot of examples of consumer activism. Even a big company like Apple. You remember in 2011, it was a lot of issues about poor working conditions with the suppliers in China. And of course, a big company like Apple, that's a supplier's issue. Why should we deal with it? But the pressure was so hard, so they actually had to recruit 800 people to go to China to do audits and inspections to secure that working conditions improved. We also have an example closer to home, Thailand, where New York Times and other media put the spotlight on the poor working conditions on Thai fishing boats. And that led to that one of the biggest companies in the world, Nestlé, had to go out and publicly confess that they actually used slave labor in their supply chain. That's a big step for them. So is this consumer activism, is this something that only happens in Europe and North America? It's not. It's actually happening all over the world. And consumers all over the world now are now starting to ask for companies running the business in a good way. What you see here is a study from Unilever, very recent, I think it was this year even, showing that, and this is a worldwide study, showing that people across the globe, and not the least in Asia, want to have companies that run the business in a responsible way. 33% of the consumers out there said, I only buy products from companies I know that are good. And 21% said, I seriously consider it when I buy products. And that's a big change. So I also believe that Thailand is at the tipping point. I believe that consumers also in Thailand want change. But I think also they don't always know how to make this happen. And here is also where you are important. You here today that are thought leaders that can help educate, can help talk about that, the importance of fair competition, the importance of zero corruption, the importance of good governance, that the companies run their business in a responsible way. Because for the consumers to make the change, it's not that difficult. They just need to start being more demanding that the companies out there should do the business in a good way. So with your favorite brands, you all have favorite brands, I assume, you should expect that those brands operate the business with a really high standard. And if they don't, you should have the courage, like the Nike customers, to ditch that brand. It's actually as simple as that to make change happen. Cup on cup.